Hi, and welcome back to the Product-Led Festival. I'm Ravi Parikh, co-founder at Heap. As a sponsor of the festival, Heap is thrilled to help product companies in all industries use data and metrics to make better decisions, to increase product market fit, and most importantly, to better serve the needs of your users. We encourage you to join the Product-Led Alliance Slack group, where we'll host Q&A with speakers from the festival and meet to discuss product issues that are most important to you. We at Heap hope you enjoy the next speaker, and please stay tuned to the rest of the festival.
Hello, welcome to our discussion on impact and control, telling a story through data. My name is Jake Walker, and I'm the Director of Product Analytics at MailChimp. In this discussion today, I'll talk to you about how you can look at measurement for your organization through the lens of your customer, and how to translate that into a framework that is usable and scalable with your organization. Creating a great product is hard. As you can see, Homer had a really difficult time with this barbecue. And so just when you think that you've actually got it, you have the Wile E. Coyote effect. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong, or your hypothesis ended up not being what you expected it to be. Customers are people, and therefore people are inherently difficult to predict at times. So this is why a strong measurement program is critical to your organization overall. But where do you start? How do you know what are the right metrics overall? And this is what this discussion is really going to be about. How do we get to identifying what those right metrics are? How do we create the connection points back to our overarching business objectives that may sit 2 or 3 levels beyond where you may be working and operating? And how do you continue to tell an effective story around the work that you're doing is working or not working, and what opportunities may exist? So let's talk about this journey to better measurement. Really, there are 3 pillars to effective product measurement at least from my perspective and the way that we look at it at MailChimp. There's your measurement framework, which is really your guardrails, ensuring that you have the right metrics that ladder back up to your business goals. This is inherently critical because it enables you to say the work that you did, maybe all the way down at a squad level, if that's the type of structure you have within your organization, how that's actually connected back to the performance that you're seeing as a business overall in terms of big metrics like revenue or churn. Impact and control metrics, which is what I'll spend a bulk of the time speaking about, really those are, I guess, simpler ways of saying leading and lagging indicators, but it means a little bit more than that. I think from a product standpoint, there's an opportunity to talk about what we can actually control, which are the levers that we pull, and what are the direct measures of our goals, therefore the impact that we're trying to make overall. We found a lot of success in that being a simplified way for people to wrap their heads around measurement in general and start getting a more coherent understanding of how to effectively use that in their day-to-day. And then metrics are pretty much useless without benchmarks and targets. The ability to lend context to performance is incredibly critical to any effective measurement program overall. And without them, your metrics are fairly meaningless overall. So how do we put this into action? Well, first we need to really rethink our product measurement strategy. So going from linear measurement step to step to step to step to really focusing on it through a customer lens or a customer-centric measurement, understanding that there are different phases of your customer's journey, and each of those phases has its own lens for context, measurement and metrics, and also tactics in which you plan to deploy in order to facilitate your customer's journey overall. So how do these things all come together? Well, what you really have is you have a couple of different layers here. You have your customer experience overall, which is the extension of how you engage with your customer end to end. So that could be incorporative of both the experience as well as how you show up as a brand, how you communicate with your customers through all channels. CX is a very broad bucket. Within that, you have the product feature journey, or so as the customer interacts with the actual product itself, and what that experience is as a subset of their CX. And then within that, you have the UX side. So what does that actual user experience look like within the engagement of the product itself? All of those things are inherently important and key inputs as we look at measuring our way through the customer journey and making this transition from linear measurement to customer-centric measurement. So let's talk about the framework overall. I know this is a fairly busy slide, and this is the best that I can do, I think, for Google Slides overall. But to give you a visual representation of kind of what I'm talking about and how these things are all interconnected, this is the machine. This is the framework. This is how you would leverage this to scale measurement within the organization. Each piece of this has an important role to play overall, ultimately leading you towards metric selection, which is really one of the last elements of this framework that gets produced. So to give you some understanding of each of these parts, our framework is powered by two key inputs, audience and goals. The audience and goals are really critical to setting up this entire framework because they are the first stage to create that connection from top down through bottom. The company goals, as the name suggests, are really set by leadership, usually at the company, and could be big metrics like X number of paid users or X revenue overall. The next layer down from that is really the product team goals. And that could be a byproduct of whether the targets based upon your estimated contribution to those goals, or something else that is at least set to influence or have an impact overall on those company goals. So in this example, 15% revenue increase in 2020 for your particular product feature, or an increase in activation rate by 10% if you're a platform that somebody has to activate on. The second part of this is the audience, and each of these really should be narrowed down to a more specific user segment. And the reason for that is that having too broad of an audience creates a lot of challenges, one associated with measurement, but also two around product development and tactical deployment. It's almost impossible to create something that works perfectly for everybody. And so it's very critical to be able to consider the highest priority customer problem that you're trying to solve, and then ensure that your audience segment is aligned with what that customer problem actually is, so that you can be specific and more curated with your approach, as well as making it easier to ultimately set a context for your measurement overall, as different user cohorts may perform differently in the same situation. And so you need to be able to effectively ladder your measurement back up to an aggregate user pool, but be able to break it down separately so that you can understand performance segment to segment. Those things basically create the lens through which our customer journey, our desired customer behaviors, and our tactics are really observed and curated overall. The customer journey stage is really one of the most critical parts of this, because identifying those key stages in the journey that are most relevant to your customer problem is very important to making sure that you're creating or deploying the right tactics, I should say, in solution to that. So the behaviors and outcomes, they're going to look different for each team and within the stages themselves. And so it's important to understand which stage you're actually trying to affect with the work that you're doing. The desired customer behavior is kind of twofold. One, it's the behavior that you would like to be able to see from customers, and two, it's understanding what the desire from the customer is and what they're capable of in terms of behavior. So it's really important to ask yourself at each stage of the journey, what ideally do we want to see from each customer? What outcome are we trying to drive? And really, what behaviors are we trying to change or get them to adopt through our work? And also whether or not they're even capable of eliciting the behaviors that we would like to see from them within the particular product experience that we're putting forward. It's important to recognize that, and that's why the audience piece is so critical. Some audiences are just not going to be capable of doing some of the things that you would like them to do. And that's okay, but it's important to know that ahead of time so that you don't try to effectively measure yourself against those cohorts. Tactics is really how your team's going to promote or enable that behavior. It's what they deploy really to influence. That's the work that they're actually going to do. It's really important to identify as well, not only where your team's going to have the most impact, but also where there might be dependencies on other teams or journey phases. So an example here would be customers or your audience segment who doesn't have sound awareness or isn't even considering the product is not going to engage in the same way as a more informed and ready to go, I guess, type of customer, for lack of a better word. And it's important to understand that, because when you're not seeing performance in the product, it's very critical to be able to pull back and understand whether or not that's something that is actually has to do with the experience, or if it has something to do with the audience, or it has something to do with the expectations being set, or something to do with the brand, and not necessarily the function of the product itself overall. Metrics and data sources are really the final elements of this, and they're really critical, as one would expect, because they measure the success overall more immediately of what you're doing. So impact and control, as I mentioned before, really they're leading and lagging indicators of success for each of the stages of the customer product journey overall. And really they enable the direct measurement of your effectiveness of the work that you're actually doing. They need to be able to ladder back to the goals that we talked about earlier on. And that's why we go through this exercise, is to create all of those connection points and have those conversations that enable those connection points, so that by the time you're at metric selection, everybody is on the same page. Data sources as well is really critical, because that's where you need to identify what the source of truth is for each of these metrics and make sure that everybody's on the same page as it relates to that. You don't want to be in a situation where one team is pulling data from here and another team is pulling data from there, while the metric name might be the same. If the inputs to that metric are different, then you're going to run into challenges. Ultimately, when it's completed, you have a framework that is really guiding and malleable artifact overall. So you continue to connect your effort to your output, but the important part here is that it's malleable. You should revisit this on a certain cadence. You should be able to discuss and change and move metrics as necessary. Not every metric you pick the first time is going to be correct or perfect, and that's okay. The point is to hypothesize, learn, understand, and that's why it really is kind of an engine. It's a recycling process that happens over and over and over again. So as you get more data, as you learn more things, you can tweak, you can improve. Your tactics may change, which means you may need new metrics, or your audience may change, and which means you need to relook at your behaviors, which may then change your tactics, which they may then change your metrics. All of these things are critical. And there is no set time frame on when you need to look at this. It's really business dependent, but you should at least relook at your audience segments and your customers probably on at least a yearly basis, if not more frequent, depending on the type of business that you're in. Okay, so let's talk about impact and control metrics. Impact metrics is really a metric that's moved by a combination of factors really outside of the control of any one group. So they're leading indicators of business health and actionable measures, but they're lagging indicators of success of the tactics that you're actually deploying as a team. So they're really hard to move. And what I mean by hard is that there's generally not going to be any one thing that you're going to be able to do to move these types of metrics. Usually it will be a combination of factors, as alluded to in the definition earlier. So that's what I mean by hard. Control metrics, those are really a measure of immediate customer or marketing problem we're working to solve that we really hypothesize will drive the impact metric. They're the levers ultimately that we pull overall. And these are metrics that you should be able to measure on almost any kind of cadence that you're looking at. These could be daily, they could be weekly, they could be monthly in some cases. But the idea is that They are a leading indicator, very directly tied to the work that you're actually doing. And in terms of day-to-day conversation, these will likely be the focus of what that communication looks like between teams in terms of opportunity relative to optimization. So if we think about this overall as like the measurement machine, you have all of these little gears, you have these levers. So imagine that you're a big machine full of gears, and there are big gears, the little gears, they all interconnect, but the levers only move really the small gears. That's your control metrics. Those are the things that you're able to do. So the little gears turn the bigger gear, and then the medium-sized gear turns the even larger gear. And really, this represents all of the things that your team can do, whether that's release a new feature, improve UX, etc. But that's what the levers ultimately are. And then you want to measure those in very short order. And if you see movement up and to the right, then that's a win. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that one thing is ultimately going to move the medium-sized gear in terms of the impact metric, but it means that you're moving in the right direction. You can check that off as a potential, as a win, and then you can move on to like the next lever that you may need to pull if you're not seeing the impact metric move in some kind of time frame after that improvement. It's also business specific. Depending on the type of product that you have, it may take longer for you to see the results of turning that little control metric gear overall, depending on like if it's about customer acquisition, what is the kind of life cycle or length of time that it generally takes for a customer to go through the purchase decision-making process. So even if you do have some effect there, you still have other factors that you need to consider, time being one of them. Although that's another way that you could possibly measure in terms of impact overall is shortening the length of time of moving customers through phases, or shortening the length of time it takes for them to ultimately convert. So we focus in here, the control metric really is that small gear. So it impacts your business level metrics like retention, activation, but it's one that is most directly impacted by our efforts. So a good example of this would be like the percentage of users for us who send their second email in less time than their first. So that's like one example of an impact metric. You can make some tactical changes to your experience, and then you could effectively measure that fairly quickly in short order. The expectation being there that if you're able to increase or decrease the amount of time to recurring adoption of something, then that in turn should have an impact on retention, and that you would measure over time, which may take month, 2, 3, up to 6, depending on what type of retention curves you look at. The impact metric is really like that. It's that medium gear I talked about. It's the leading indicator for big business goals. So revenue, total paid users, but it's really hard to move by any one single action overall. So a good example of this would be percentage of prospects who successfully complete sign up within 24 hours of their first visit. So there's several things that you would have done in order to try to improve that time to sign up completion within that 24 hours of that visit. And so as you make improvements in those areas, i.e. turn the control metric gears, then you would see your impact metric gear turn in the form of completed signups or activation or whatever metric you might be measuring for that. The last and the biggest gear is our business goals. So it's the largest gear in the machine, as you can see, and it has many internal and external factors. So examples of this would be total revenue, paid user growth rate, Those are all things that outside of just the experience overall, there are many other factors. For us at MailChimp, the success of the customer's business is another factor. So with a situation like COVID-19, that's an external factor that we don't really have much control over from a day-to-day, but can ultimately impact our business goals, as I'm sure everybody else is ultimately feeling. So it's something to take into account and to consider as you're thinking about like how what the work that you've done has impacted overall the business goals. All right, so how do we tie impact metrics to product team objectives? So really, they're the first connecting layer when really measuring objectives developed within your framework. So impact metrics serve as tangible goals. They're connected to journey stages, and that domains, in this case for us, are impacting. And so you kind of see where they ultimately live here in that kind of structure. And then in terms of control metrics, what's the importance here? Really, the team should aim to pick metrics that measure things over which they have the highest possible degree of control. So you don't necessarily have full control over everything. Again, we are talking about human beings in a lot of cases in terms of what we're trying to, the people or the things that we're trying to get to do something. And so therefore, you don't have 100% of control, but it's the highest possible degree of control. So it means that when a team ships something, metrics should be a good indicator of their success. The control metrics should not be easily influenced by seasonality or pricing changes. That can really obscure a team's success overall and muddy things up. So it's really important to make sure that your metrics have and are able to account for volumetric things, seasonal things, etc. And it's also important to note that we can't control user behavior, but many good control metrics will really be based on user outcomes. So that's really what we mean here by highest possible degree of control. So let's talk about creating a measurement plan. First, how do we actually go about selecting the right metrics? There are 5 kind of key questions here that you can ask to make sure that you're heading down the right path for metric selection overall. So number 1, are they measurable? Pretty self-explanatory, but are they actually measurable? Are you trying to measure something that is actually measurable by your company and that can drive decision making? Some metrics actually just aren't measurable. That happens for a multitude of reasons. Technological limitations, the data just isn't usable for some particular reason, or there just is no possible way to effectively measure it in a way where you would want to use it to make decisions. So it's really critical to ask yourself that first question. Are they meaningful? So just because something is measurable doesn't actually mean that it's meaningful. And they should really be able to easily relate back to your business questions and your goals. And if they don't, then that metric really isn't meaningful. Are they comparative? So this kind of goes back to talking earlier around benchmarks and targets. If there's not an easy way to benchmark or set a target for the metric that you have, and they're not comparative, then why are you measuring it in the first place? You can't really do anything with a metric that you can't lend context to performance. Saying that we increased something by 5%, well, so what? Is 5% good? Is 5% bad? After the 5% increase, where are we at? And where we are now, is that good or bad? How is that compared to our competition, our competitor set? How does that compare to the industry averages? All of those things are really critically important because without it, you could end up celebrating something as a win that actually was a loss, or you end up celebrating something that actually could have been significantly better. So that 5% increase really should have been 30%, but you didn't know that. Are they understandable? So can they be framed basically in plain language? Can people who are not analytics, who are not data centric or data savvy, I should say, are they able to easily understand the metrics? All of your non-technical partners, essentially. It's very critical. Nobody is going to use anything or adopt something that they inherently don't understand. And are they leading indicators? So do they actually predict future results? And are they not just simply report on things that are happening? So vanity metrics is a very real issue. You have to be, wary of that because vanity metrics are not necessarily a leading indicator of anything. They are an outcome or an output, but they don't necessarily are not a leading indicator. So, revenue going up and to the right, that's all fine and dandy. But what is that? Is that a leading indicator of, I guess, business health in some way, shape, or form? But in terms of like your product overall, et cetera, making sure that you're selecting the right leading indicators for the work that you're doing is really, really critical. Just talking about number of users, for instance, that begin to adopt a particular product, that's not necessarily a leading indicator because there are a lot of factors that could be associated with why you're seeing volume increase. That could have been increased spends in marketing. That could have been a promotion that's going on, something along those lines. And that doesn't necessarily mean future sustained results. So then how do we make metrics actionable? So questions for you to really consider in this particular area around making your metrics actionable. How will changes in this metric impact your decision making? What decisions are you hoping to actually inform? Again, if a metric moves and nobody cares, then was it really worth measuring in the first place? It's a tree falling in the woods and nobody's around to hear it. It's a similar situation for your metrics. What doesn't the metric tell you? So really, are there any of those questions or uncertainties something that you need to address through additional metrics? So no one metric to rule them all. Or should you consider changing the one that you've selected if it doesn't do a good enough job of I guess, coordinating or really showcasing broadly enough the story? And going back to the impact versus control piece, control metrics, you may have multiple metrics. Impact metrics, you probably want to reduce the number that you have, because if you have 50 metrics, then none of those metrics are actually important. How do you zero in on those that are actually most meaningful? And asking your question of what a metric doesn't tell you can help you identify whether or not you have a gap. Really assume like that all product development activities had stopped. Would that metric change? For how long and why? So it's a great test really for the time between business and initiative goal and impact metric. And really just a good test overall as to whether or not the metrics that you're selecting are actually actionable and meaningful. If you stop development, you still see a metric moving and it continues to move at the pace before, then it's pretty clear that whatever you were doing wasn't necessarily the reason behind the movement of that metric. And it doesn't mean that the metric is invalid, but it does mean that it's not a good actionable metric for measuring the success of the work that you're actually doing. What will be your signal to really revisit the metrics? So assuming that you revisit them periodically, like I mentioned earlier, how are you going to determine if it's still useful? And so that goes back into understanding what are the changes in the work, what are the changes, if any, in the actual customer behaviors? Are they doing something differently? Are they an entirely different cohort? Those are the things that you need to be able to ask yourself. And that's why it's important to go back and revisit your framework on some kind of consistent basis to make sure that you're still measuring the right things and that those metrics are still the most actionable metrics for you. So how do we define a great metric? So on the left side, really, we have kind of the makeup of a good metric. It measures the use of a product by a person. It's normalized, so it's a rate or a percentage. It's not just a number, so i.e. the vanity number piece. It's comparable and trackable over time. Those are things that make up good metrics. So how do we take good and turn them into great? Well, a great metric also includes an object per user, per session, per week. Something that brings a little bit more definition to what it is that you're actually measuring. And it also then instills priority. So basically, nothing else matters if we don't move this. Going back to the machine metaphor from earlier, if the little gears don't move, the bigger gears don't move. I think that's really critical to keep in mind, because in the moment, it can feel like sometimes the work is difficult or not as meaningful, etc. And in some cases, you may have an organization that's focuses on and rewards successes that are on a bigger stage. They talk a lot about revenue or those types of metrics, and so, but it's important to remember that those numbers wouldn't be moving if it weren't for the work that was being done downstream. So those little gears are really important, and making sure that you instill priority within your metrics is critical. So metric writing checklist for you, some things to consider, right? Does your new metric begin with a measurement? Percentage of median time to, those are good examples, and making sure that your metric meets some of these great metric standards along with the good metric standards. Is it specific? Specify the target customer or prospect. So example, new users with a list who, or e-commerce users or paying customers who do a thing. Making sure that there is understanding of specificity around the target. Does it specify a behavior that you're looking to measure? So example here, send an email to less than 10 contacts, or add an audience to their email draft. Making sure that whatever you're selecting as a metric has the behavior baked into it. That is going to be more effective for you on a day-to-day. It's also going to help when it comes to challenging things like attribution, especially as we move into the next piece on this checklist. Does it end with a time frame? So time boxing things is a great way to help control the environment. When you leave things too open-ended or the time frame's too long, you open yourself up to attribution challenges. So multiple exposures, multiple interactions, etc. And that can be a really difficult thing to overcome, particularly in the product world, where you have a lot of possible interactions that can happen in a short period of time. Being able to tease out which one of those was the reason why something happened, or which combination of those was the reason why something happened, can be very difficult. So incorporating a time frame helps to control for some of those things. All right, so we're moving into just some examples, yes, no, as to what good impact and control metrics look like, and kind of why. So total adopted users, total revenue, total automations users, those are no's. Why are they no's? Well, total adopted users, really that's a vanity metric. It's something that we want to avoid. It's also a lagging indicator. So while it's being impacted by multiple tactics across the customer journey. So there's just way too many uh, potential reasons or forces that can be exerted on that for that to be an effective indicator. So total revenue, it's a goal, it's not an impact metric. So really, revenue is the byproduct of many activities overall. It's a lagging indicator of success. Total automations users also might be a metric that you want to impact in this example, but it's really impacted by company X's overall growth. And it really doesn't pass the rubric for being a leading indicator or actionable. Again, the reason being, you can have a lot of external sources. Hey, we started spending 2x the amount of money on trying to attract automations users. That doesn't necessarily mean that your experience that you're creating as a product is better. You had an external force that was exhibited on that particular metric, so it's not a good one. Sign up completion rate. So percentage of sign up page visitors who successfully complete a sign up within X time frame. So this is a good example of an impact metric. It's something we can measure with a relatively short time period. While it can be impacted by multiple factors, it should be strongly correlated really with the initiatives that you're working on, and an indicator that really that you're having a positive business impact overall. So you may have made multiple changes, say, to your onboarding flow for your product, and I'm talking about SaaS at this point. And because of that, you see an increase in your sign-up rate, and therefore, because you saw an increase in your sign-up rate, then you're going to see an increase in your revenue, et cetera, overall. So that is a very good example of what an impact metric could look like. Control metrics. So there's a couple of things to consider here. Well, really just the relative degree of control actually along with as you're thinking about your metric. So annual recurring revenue really of feature users, or the retention rate of users, or the number of new users. Two of those you have very low control over. In the case of our business, that's going to heavily depend on the size of their audience, how long they've been on the platform. It really doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a feature of the product. Retention rate, again, many factors can go into that. You have low control, there's compliance to consider, and really have nothing to do with feature X. Also, person's company could have just gone out of business. In our case, because we focus on small businesses at MailChimp in particular, that's something that we have to consider. In some cases, people stop using something because their business is no longer, doesn't exist anymore. And that isn't, as much as we would love to be able to make sure that every small business is successful. In some cases, there are factors outside of our control that even a great marketing platform can't solve for. And we're living through one right now in the form of COVID. Number of new features, X users. So we have some control over that. So discoverability is something that we may have some control over overall, and it might play a role in that metric. It can also be really conflated with overall user growth and marketing efforts. So that is mostly just a vanity metric. A really great then example of a control metric is at the bottom here. Publish rates of new feature on the first attempt, or percentage of users that begin creating X at least X times in the first X days. You have a high degree of control. You are measuring whether or not they're attempting to make use of a feature and are able to do so, which is a direct measurement of the thing that you're producing. And the team has a high degree over usability and utility, and therefore this measure is something that has a high degree of control and therefore is a candidate as a great control metric. And that's it. So I want to thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to my presentation. And I wish that I could have been there in person and done this live, but we're all adapting, and I'm just excited and glad that we're still able to do this even remotely overall. So hope everyone is safe and healthy, and thank you once again.